My group and I are going to discuss the two classes of campus diversity and foundations of higher education. We're going to talk about the important aspects of each of those courses, how the two of them tie into higher ed, and then how the two of them tie into one another. I'm going to start off talking about foundations, and then Leslie is going to tie us into the concept of worldview, and then how that relates to diversity, and then Tim will finish us out with diversity class as a whole. So let's get started. So just kind of the overarching idea of higher education, I thought this class was a representation of the gospel in a way, just the creation, fall, redemption, restoration story, where creation, God created each person is in his image according to its kind, and then he loves us and has a plan for our life. But then in Genesis 3, sin enters the world, which separates us from a relationship with God. Because God loves us, he wants a sacrifice that will cover those sins and bring us back into relationship with him. So Jesus becomes that atonement and comes to give us new life. And then now God is working to bring restoration to the world that is still very broken, and we each have unique gifts and callings and a role to play in that restoration process. Something that Keith said in this class that really stuck out to me was that even people that are not Christians know that things are not right in the world. We don't have to be Christian to know that, and that's why we work so hard to cover up what's not right inside of us, which is the shame factor. And we all want freedom from that shame. We don't agree on how to get that freedom, but we all want that freedom. So specifically in higher ed, some of that freedom, just a few examples would be like freedom in the classroom, freedom in research and publication, and then freedom of expression as a citizen. Those are just kind of three things that I know we talked about. So in why we do this job is really essentially to cultivate intellect and thought for students. Like everything that we do with students, whether in a traditional classroom setting, in residence life, in athletics, in campus ministry, etc., should be to develop thought. It should have purpose behind it. It should not be meaningless. And this kind of translates into the concept of worldview, which, as I said before, Leslie's going to talk a lot more about that. And so I won't go too deep into it, but essentially, worldview determines our values and interprets the world around us for us. It's going to show us what are our highest and lowest priorities, and then our actions is what shows other people outwardly what our worldview is. So maybe what we want or what we think our worldview is not what our actions display, which is why we get this idea of hypocrisy. So example for me, I know in this class we had to write a paper on a time where our worldview shifted. And our worldview is kind of set for us. It's just the way we see the world based on the background that we have. It's not something that, like we kind of develop a worldview at a pretty young age. So my personal worldview shift story, I wrote about how in college, before coming to college, my family, I grew up in a super conservative family, very much held the idea of conservative equals Christian. If you're conservative, or if you're a Christian, you need to have conservative mindset because that's the political views that most closely align with Jesus. I never questioned that. I never thought that could be any different. But in college, when I first got to school, I met, I want to say 4 different people over the time span of about 2 years, those first 2.5 years, that completely believed differently. Their families had voted Democratic growing up, but I saw in all of these people just like a genuine love for Jesus. And that really started to shift the way that I think, because it was taking two things, the Democratic Party and Christianity, that I thought could never work together. And so that kind of leads to the next point of your experiences. Once you have multiple experiences that cause you to question why, like, why do I believe this? Why is this important? Why does this matter? After multiple times of doing that, you start to develop your own thought process, which leads to a theory and later becomes part of your philosophy of life. So for me, it wasn't just that very first person that caused me to shift everything that I think. It was multiple people that I started to think about, like, okay, is the worldview that I grew up in, that the piece of the worldview that I grew up in with the conservative equals Christian, is that actually accurate to everyone, or can that differ? And I came to the conclusion that it can differ. I think there are people that can vote conservatively and people that can vote more liberally, can all be followers of Jesus. But that was like a really big shift in my own personal life. But those things are no longer an assumption or something that I just take at face value. I learned how to be critical with that and stand on that belief. So that's one part of my like philosophy of life, so to speak, even though that isn't my philosophy of life, but it's kind of a part of what formed that. So our philosophy of life, though, should determine how we do our job. So why you are in higher education should relate back to what is your philosophy of life. It should change the way that you see students and the way that you love what you're doing. And I remember Keith saying one time, if you can't figure out why the thing that you want to do is in higher education, then why are you in higher education? I remember looking at several different philosophies of educations, Kahn and Dewey and McElhaney, but we also got further into this in the learning and knowledge class, so it was decently basic here. And then just kind of determining what is the purpose of education, which was labeled X. But what is the purpose of education? Why are we here? What is the purpose of your specific department in education? Because I think something else that I learned, and this kind of goes into how it's going to connect to diversity, but it's really easy to stay in our current corner of the world with people with a similar worldview that came from a similar background, and never leave that corner, which I don't think is how the kingdom of God works. I think in higher education, the goal is to teach students to value and celebrate and recognize diversity and difference in worldview and different philosophies of life and all of those things. Like, I think, I just think those things matter. So I don't want to get too far into worldview, but Foundations was kind of the basis of finding your purpose to why we do our job. And so I'm going to let this transition into Leslie, and she's going to talk more in depth about the concept of worldview and further connection to why that matters for diversity.
Hello, everyone. I'm excited to be able to share a little bit with you today about diversity and worldviews from the courses that I took during Summer Institute some years ago. Obviously, the information is going to be a little different than what you actually experienced in your courses, but it should overlap in many ways and also integrate into the information that you received. So I'm going to go ahead and jump on in and just share how higher education basically has evolved over the years, but something that we know has remained true to this day is that worldviews informs it all. Our worldviews and the way that we see the world, the lenses through which we look, and all the issues that flow from our life experiences innately causes us to tend towards addressing student development in a way that we perceive student needs. This is why concepts surrounding worldviews in higher education is really important for us to evaluate and to look at the very beginning. And so when I took the course initially, worldviews was one of the very first courses that I took. I think it was my first course. And so it really laid the groundwork for helping me to understand that we all have this lens that we look through. and we all know that the diversity of the lived experiences among higher education professionals, even at the highest levels, especially at the highest levels of institutional leadership, informs best practices that we operate under and the policies that we use in our everyday work. So it's really important for us to understand and be able to self-evaluate and self-reflect on what it is that we perceive as our worldviews. So how impactful and necessary is knowledge of worldviews and diversity education for us as professionals? So let's jump on in and evaluate and look at some of the concepts that we discussed in our courses. In looking at Walter's definition of worldview, the comprehensive framework of one's basic beliefs, we were led to a self-evaluation of our own basic beliefs and the contributing factors that cause us to form the worldviews that we have now. As we collectively self-evaluated and heard each other's perspectives, we were able to better understand how relevant worldview is in student development. The way I described it in one paper was worldview is like lenses through which I view the sum of my life. To wake up one day and realize you've been wearing glasses all your life and not knowing it is startling. But what's even more startling is the discovery of what happens when you take those lenses off and try to look at life through someone else's lens and try to get an understanding of what they believe and what they perceive. So it's just basically the worldview course gave me a brief glimpse into other people's worlds and how student development also tries to use worldviews and diversity to inform how it is that we operate and function. Some would say diversity is a separatist notion that actually brings division by pointing out difference. But what we actually learned in the course, both courses actually, worldviews and diversity, is that it's actually a celebration of God-given attributes and the unique approaches to life that we all bring to the work that we do and will encounter with the students we serve. So Walter said also, grace does not bring a donum superaddendum to nature, a gift added on top of creation. Rather, grace restores nature, making it whole once more. In understanding worldview and diversity, we are granted a grace to experience restoration, to see us collectively made whole and one through understanding compassion. These most fundamental beliefs we hold to be true feed right into our understanding of diversity and its role in higher education work. So are we supposed to bust open students' worldview boxes? Are we supposed to take off their lenses and sometimes it seems like some institutions try to throw out their lens, say it's not good. Are we supposed to give that judgment or just simply present them the information and let them do with it what they believe that they should do? So in the diversity course, we got a chance to discuss some of these concepts, discuss the boxes that we come in, the backpack, and some of those different concepts that are discussed in diversity. And one of the learning outcomes that that we really wanted to address in there was how to develop sensitivities to and appreciation for diversity within higher education. So example of like listening and exploring the complex experiences of diverse groups on our campus and also reflecting on our own racial identity and how it influences our work and perspective. While many want to toss out the idea of racial diversity in discussion, it was something that was really a big part of our course because the Race Project exhibit was traveling through Pittsburgh at the time. And if you want to learn more about the Race Project exhibit, you can go to www.understandingrace.org. And it gives more information about just more of the anthropological and historical background of race and how it came to be and how it was a tool of oppression for people groups throughout history, but also now that it's already in place and it's already here, for someone like me, they may even be a source of identity for those who can't trace their background and their family ancestry real closely. It provides a people group for Black Americans overall. So there was a great deal of discussion about that and why it is that it continues to be a discussion today. And one of the greatest outcomes that we had from those discussions and from Summer Institute was that there was a class-wide consensus of the importance of diversity discussions for ourselves and our students. Diversity can be a very emotional a very emotional topic, and it can be approached from a very emotional slant. But what we're able to do in the diversity course, and what we actually did that summer, was to treat it as an academic topic worthy of research and discussion. We got a chance to see it from those historical and anthropological lenses, and actually also look at ways that it impacts retention, and how it is that we can better address retention issues. Kind of along that same vein, we read a text called Whistling Vivaldi by Claude Steele. He explored the concept of stereotype threat and how it affects performance for all people, meaning that everybody has been stereotyped in some kind of way, and depending on how that stereotype impacts and might be a part of your work, whether it's in diversity discussions as a student affairs professional, or it's a task that you have to do, or even sports. The book really delves into how everybody deals with some of those voices in the background that are telling us different stereotypes about ourselves. And so I really recommend, if you haven't read Whistling Vivaldi by Claude Steele, it's a really good book, and it really will help you think about ways that you can help students work through stereotype threat and those fears and those concerns. And so his research basically led to some really robust discussions about how we can better serve our students. And from that, I also recognized that by having these discussions in the class and being able to look at what our worldviews are and our perceptions of diversity, we were able to better understand each other and gain an appreciation for how it is that we do the work that we do, and continue to love our students well in the way that Christ would want us to. And so now I want to turn it over to Tim. He's going to discuss diversity from the cohort standpoint that you all have experienced. So thank you for listening.
Hey guys, so I'm going to be talking about the class we took, Foundations of Campus Diversity. Most of you took it with Brad last spring. Kind of the first thing I did was look at the outcomes on the syllabus. So there are about 9. I kind of picked the 3 that stood out to me as outcomes and goals of the class that I think were the big points of the class. So the 3 are: develop a perspective on a nationwide multicultural debate, be able to strategize and prepare a campus diversity assessment, and then understand the tension between dominant and dominated groups on campus. Those 3, especially the strategize and prepare, with the assignments that we did, having to come up with a conduct policy at a place like Geneva, and then understanding the tension between the dominant and the dominated. So the majority of people at an institution versus the minority, I think that was big. So just looking at a couple of readings and books that we did, the first, when I thought of this class, I thought of this book that we had, Strategy, Diversity, Leadership. We spent pretty much a whole class talking about it, and I think it was something that stood out. So their definition of strategic diversity leadership is grounded in the assumption that affecting persuasive change around issues of diversity, like any other domain, is both art and science. Diversity goals are never easily achieved. Consequently, campus diversity champions, regardless of their institutional role, must be sophisticated in their approach and willing to cut against the grain of tradition, artfully navigating issues both anticipated and unanticipated, and applying the best diversity science possible to move the agenda forward and overcome an often deeply ingrained legacy of exclusion. So what I get out of that, the biggest sentence to me is diversity goals are never easily achieved. Kind of a theme as I go through this, big one is it's not easily fixed. You can't just put on a Band-Aid over diversity and it's over with. There has to be a ton of research, a ton of study, smart people whose lives are involved around this in order to make it successful in higher ed. So the 5 principles of strategic diversity leadership that the book kind of goes through. Number 1 is redefine issues of diversity and inclusion as fundamental to the organizational bottom line of mission fulfillment and institutional excellence. So the biggest thing is the mission fulfillment. So we kind of talk about in a lot of classes about mission statements of colleges, what they really mean, what they represent. To me, that just means it can't just be some department that's in a corner of a building. It has to be ingrained in what you believe in what the institution believes that they're about. Number 2 is focus on creating systems that enable all students, faculty, and staff to thrive and achieve their maximum potential. So having a design plan that, you don't just have kids just come onto campus. There has to be a plan where they're not just there, but they're thriving and succeeding. Number 3 is achieve a more robust and integrated diversity approach that builds on prior diversity models and operates in a strategic, evidence-based, and data-driven manner where accountability is paramount. So kind of going back to the evidence-based research and just having the intelligence to just be aware. So then in the book, they kind of talk about the perfect storm of diversity emergence as a strategic priority. So right here, if you guys remember, we talked about this a lot, and I think it's important just to, I'll just name them. I won't go through them all, but there's five that add to the perfect storm. Emergence of a knowledge-based global economy, changing demographics, persistent political, social, and economic inequalities, the educational and business care for diversity, and then political and legal threats to diversity in education. These 5 things are very important to your diversity team, to higher ed, to your leaders at your institution. Understanding what these mean. Again, I won't go through them because I don't have time. But, I think this book overall, I started out with this book just because I think it's important and kind of encapsulates everything diversity-wise that can help whatever position you're in at an institution and higher ed in general. Next thing, we read a book, Forgive Us, and there's a quote in there, kind of add to the Christianity thing. Dysfunctional Christian imagination is unwilling to protest against the dehumanization of an immigrant. The use of terms illegal immigrant stands against the powerful story that all of humanity was made in the image of God. The inability of Christianity to stand against falsehood and speak truth to address the dysfunctional worldview is a failure to the Christian imagination. So what I get out of this, it says illegal immigrant. I kind of see that just as any minority in general, but that we are all made in the image of God. So we are one. And that's how, to tie into the foundations part of it, that's how we should lead as higher ed professionals, just as people in general, that we all are made in that image of God, and we should, not have biases or anything like that. And then we read the diversity imperative. It just talks about how research is critically important to building higher education's capacity for diversity. Some of the examples are effective educational practices, experiencing higher education, educational benefits of diversity, faculty diversity, merging conceptualizations of identity and intergroup research. Again, just kind of talking about understanding the depths of diversity, doing the research. It's not just put a Band-Aid over it and it's fixed. It takes time to develop. It takes a team, takes that culture. All in all, those are the biggest things that I got out of this class. Now for the future, how this can help you in your field. Obviously diversity is so big now. It talked, in this book, it mentions how the minority will be the majority soon. In what ways can our institutions help create that sense of inclusion when it comes to diversity. And I think from this class, it's called Foundations of Campus Diversity. So it starts from that mission statement, from that culture of your institution. I know, where I'm at now, it's known for being a very high academic, very expensive school. And in the position I'm in, a lot of schools like using athletics, especially football, to bump up that diversity. But if we don't allow students of minority students to thrive at our university, then we're just stealing their money and not doing them any favors. So it has to start. It can't just be, hey, everyone come on in. It has to start from the ground up. I hope you guys liked our video. And yeah, stay safe.